I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet.
Okay, that's good for us, that we are neither prophets or sons of prophets. Probably that's good. Okay, let's continue our reading of the text from the place we stopped last year, and we stopped in the middle of the pericope about the healing of the blind man in Jericho. Chapter 10, verse 49. Лариса, вы у нас выступали в качестве нашей чтицы на наших последних встречах. Давайте попросим вас продолжить эту роль.
We don't see your text.
Sorry.
From the verse 49, yeah?
Exactly.
Kai stas ho Iisus eipen, fonesate auton, kai fonusin tontuflon legontes auto, tarsei, egere foneise. Gode apobalon to imatio autu, anapedesas, elten prostonesun, kai apocriteis auto, ho Iisus eipen, tisoi teli ho Ieso. Godetiuflos eipen auto raguni, yina anablepso. Kai ho Iisus eipen auto iupage ge pistis su sesokense. Kai eutius aneblepsen kai ekалутei auto энтегодо.
Иисус остановился и сказал: «Позовите его». Слепого позвали. Я думаю, что «legontes auto» можно в русском переводе сократить до двоеточия. «Смелее, вставай, он зовет тебя». Слепой вскочил с места, сбросив с себя плащ, и подошел к Иисусу. Не задумался, откуда взялось тотчас же возможность какого-то альтернативного чтения. Но будем следовать нашему тексту. Иисус спрашивает его: «Что ты хочешь, чтобы я сделал для тебя?» Слепой ответил: «Раббуни, чтобы я стал зрячим». Иисус говорит ему: «Иди, вера твоя спасла тебя». Он тотчас стал видеть и пошел за Иисусом по дороге. As far as I remember, Joel, you mentioned several times that two stories about blind men, the first healing story and the second healing story, function as a kind of two brackets, the opening one and the closing one, around the narrative about Jesus going to Jerusalem. Can we see any contrast, any progression between these two stories?
Well, Jesus seems to have less trouble with this one. You know, he only, because in the previous one, you know, it was a two-stage healing. And at first it didn't work perfectly. And this one works from the beginning. I mean, the
Yes,
other story is more strange, I think.
What was what verses were the first healing?
It's chapter 8, verses 22 to 26.
When I was asking about whether there's any progression between these two stories, I was wondering whether, in fact, the endings of the two stories may be regarded as contrasting. The first story ends with Jesus sending the cured man home, but the former blind man does not follow Jesus. Here, at the end of chapter 10, he ekalute auto ente hodo.
Yes, and ente hodo is, you know, that phrase has occurred several times in this section, right? So this section really is about following Jesus in the way. A lot of it is instruction to the disciples. So I do think both of these healings, but especially this one, is symbolic of what discipleship means. It means having your blindness healed and following. And those two things go together symbolically. So I do think you're right about there is a contrast. You know, the first guy is sent back home, and that happens in some other of the healings in the first 8 chapters. But this guy becomes a follower, and he follows Jesus up to Jerusalem, up to the place where Jesus is going to suffer and die.
Yes, here I just searched through our Bible works the expression ente hodo. In Mark. This notion starts from chapter 8. Ente hodo, Jesus asks his disciples, what do people think about him? This is a prologue to Peter's confession. 9:33, Jesus asked his disciples what were they discussing, and tohodo, and this is also a preface to the next prediction about Jesus. No, it's linked to Jesus' prediction about his future fate, and is also linked with this topic of disciples' misunderstanding of Jesus in their search for power and greatness. Mark 10:32 again has and then told an abundance eis Jerusalem.
Yeah. So ente hodo is especially linked with the predictions of the suffering and
Yes.
death of Jesus. And you notice also in this section in chapters 8 to 10, there's a lot of references to entering the basileia to theou. You know, that's another thing that's conjoined with it. And so there's various structuring devices, I think, all of which point towards instruction in discipleship, instruction in following Jesus, and especially following him in the way of suffering.
Yes, and this is all these enter her door. They occur exactly within this part of the narrative, which is connected to Jesus going from Galilee to Jerusalem. The narrative which is framed with these two stories of healing blind people.
Mhm.
Okay. I think this comparison of the two stories about blind people may be important for our understanding of the structure of the gospel. Do you have any other remarks on this particular pericope?
Yes. Well, one other thing, uh, one other idea I've had, and I think I mentioned it maybe a few times in my commentary, but I maybe I should write an article about it. Is if you can go back to the passage, um, because we're still seeing Bible works now.
Okay. Now
I
that's
have
our diaglos, yeah?
yeah. Now we see it. Yeah, I have thought sometimes uh, that these stories probably would have reminded Christian readers of baptism. Um, I think, you know, there's evidence beginning in the second century that Christians referred to baptism as an illumination. Uh, so it's, you know, it's related to coming to the light. Um, and I can't remember what else reminded me of baptism. I mean, it's always seemed to me that this phrase in 52, "He pistis su sesokense," your faith has saved you. It has a rhythmic, uh, it has a certain rhythm to it, and it could have been used. I'm not sure I have any evidence for this, but it could have been used as a part of Christian baptism. You know, you go into the water, and when you come out of the water, you hear these words, "Hey, you know, your faith has saved you." So it's somewhat speculative, but I wonder if Mark's readers would have been reminded of their own baptisms. Maybe by this and some of the other stories in the gospel, because we know also that baptism was connected to exorcism. And probably there's evidence of that from the 2nd century on too. And I guess, yeah, in this one also, the guy throws aside his garment when he comes to encounter Jesus. So that could also be, that could also remind Mark's readers of their own baptism.
You mentioned that after the baptism, the one baptized coming out of the water heard something like epistis su sesakanse.
Yeah, this is my speculation. I'm just
Okay.
saying that it would fit, and that it has a certain rhythmic nature, and I don't know. I may have some other arguments for this somewhere, but I can't remember what they are.
But do we have these words anywhere in the texts of the early church dealing with baptism? I don't know.
No,
Probably yes, but
yeah. Let me see if I talk about this and go on and let's talk about some other things, and maybe I'll oh yeah, okay. Let's see. I have a paragraph about this in my commentary. So I talk about evidence of people taking off their clothes to be baptized. The apostolic, yeah,
Joel, which page?
it's on page 760.
760, okay.
Yeah. Oh, let's see. Yeah. Hold on. Maybe it's a different page. Let's see. Hold on. 749 to 52. Yeah, I guess we should really go to page 760. Well, hold on a second. Yeah, page 765, actually.
So 765, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so down, yeah, the paragraph that begins lower, yeah. Certain features of the narrative are reminiscent of Christian baptism. Baptism is described as an illumination starting with Justin Martyr. And ancient Christian art depicts biblical stories of the healing of blind people, especially that of the man born blind in baptismal settings. Other features that are reminiscent are the removal of clothing, which we've already talked about. Okay, the formula, your faith has saved you. So, okay, we'll have to look back at what I say on 534, and even the way language. Okay, so if you go down like a little bit, this is me imagining a Christian baptismal service. The person being baptized says, "Has mercy on me." The deacon says, "Call him." The congregation says, you see, I'm drawing things from this story. Be brave, get up, he's calling you. He goes forward, and the deacon says, what do you want me to do? I want to be illuminated. And the deacon says, your faith has saved you. So let's see what I say about 534. That's in the other volume. Hold on. Chapter 5, verse 34. Okay, your faith has saved you. This is on page 360. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Where do I talk about baptism here? I guess it's page 361. Yeah. Saving faith is explicitly mentioned, especially in Pauline and Deutero-Pauline correspondence, and in Luke Acts. Your faith has saved you may, as a matter of fact, be a baptismal formula, as a couple of people have already argued. One of the passages linking salvation and faith mentions baptism, Mark 6:16, and another has frequently been identified as a baptismal confession. And several others have clear baptismal associations. The baptismal formula interpretation is also supported by its use in later Christian history. Both Tertullian and Cyprian cite it in the context of discussions of baptism. So this
Okay.
is what we call circumstantial evidence.
Yes,
But
this may go back to the baptismal formula, though we do not have exact early witnesses.
as we say in contemporary English, there's no smoking gun.
Yes.
But if there was a smoking gun, then somebody would have discovered it before. I don't know. There was a point, I think, before and while I was writing my commentary, where I saw baptismal imagery everywhere. But the truth is, we don't really know that much about earliest Christian baptism. I mean, the only evidence I think we have from the first century is very circumstantial, or Acts just tells us that people were baptized with their families. Doesn't say anything about the how it was done. And it used to be that people would say that the earliest evidence is this apostolic tradition from Hippolytus, but now I think people think that is not actually from Hippolytus, who was at the end of the 2nd century. So there's really not a lot of solid evidence to go on when you're wondering what earliest Christian baptism looked like.
Okay, thank you. Православные отцы, братья и сестры, в контексте того особого ударения, которое православная традиция уделяет истории таинств. Кто-нибудь помнит что-нибудь про ранние христианские крещенские, связанные с крещением, в смысле кредо или обряды?
Кредо вы имеете в виду формулы символа веры?
Скорее не формулы, символы веры, а обстоятельства, тексты, сопровождавшие крещение в ранней церкви. Просто, в общем, ведь гипотеза, которую сейчас Джоэль приложил, достаточно любопытная. Вот что здесь у нас вот эти выражения типа «эпистису сесоконсе» и прочие отсылки к спасению, к содзо, могут быть как-то связаны с раннехристианскими формулами крещальными. Мне кажется, это любопытная идея. И, может, как раз православным экзегетам она может быть особенно любопытна.
Ну, это, наверное, надо смотреть памятник учений 12 апостолов Дидахе, что там сказано, потому что у так называемых мужей апостольских апологетов II века там мало что информации, только косвенная.
Ну да, надо просто, может быть, косвенно что-то связано. Любопытно, я не знаю. А не хотел бы кто-нибудь из нашего семинара вот эту тему, которую сейчас Джоэль поднял, мне кажется, она и Джоэлю тоже очень близка и интересна, подробнее посмотреть по раннехристианским и отеческим текстам. Нет у нас желающих?
Ну, если говорить обо мне, то это, наверное, не раньше, чем через 2 недели. На следующей неделе не успею. Это
Да у нас же
через...
нету какого-то такого графика, что мы должны обязательно к такому-то числу сдать отчет по гранту или что-то еще.
Мгм.
Поэтому, если, в принципе, для вас эта тема интересна, отец Ириней,
Я возьму на примету себе, хорошо.
то возьмите на примету, если когда-то
Да-да, я понял.
что-то сможете нам сказать, то будем вам с благодарностью вас выслушаем.
Мгм. Спасибо.
А можно я небольшую вещь скажу?
Да, конечно.
The only thing I can say that it is well known that the last period of the preparation of the people for the baptism was called in the early church enlightenment. And those who were baptized were called enlightened people. And so these items are close, very, very close.
Yes.
Topic of light and baptism.
Да, в нашей церковно-славянской терминологии просвещение и просвещаемое. Кстати, как это интересно в греческих звучит требниках.
This enlightenment terminology also, it's already there in the epistle to the Hebrews in chapter 10, verse 32. And there it seems to indicate entrance into the Christian life. No specific reference to baptism, but since baptism was the ritual by which people entered into the Christian life, I would say, that's also some early evidence that the terminology may go back to the 1st century. Photosthentes.
Resistentes, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, I guess I think that the argument is strengthened by just the fact that, these narratives of the healing of blind men are obviously symbolic, right? And Mark seems to be aware of their symbolism and to have placed them very deliberately, at the beginning and end of this section of instruction of disciples.
Meanwhile, before we move to the next pericope, I just looked at the usage of the verb sozo in Mark, and I was struck that there's a certain, I'd like to say, pattern in this. In first chapters of Mark, sozo refers always to healing in the most literal and physical form. There is a discussion between Jesus and his opponents about healing. The one with that hand, then the same verb is used when we read about the healing of the daughter. Then the lady who had blood,
Flow of blood.
yes, flow of blood. Once again, she says, "Anto maitjuno tu apsamai, sotesumai." Once again, the healing of the woman. And Mark 6:56, those who were brought to Jesus to be healed were healed. All these occurrences refer to physical healing. Then the meaning changes abruptly with the verse, with chapter 8. We have already mentioned that with verse 8, a new topic comes into being. Osgar an teletem scenautu sosi, apolese autem. Was an
Here the term becomes eschatological.
Yeah, it becomes eschatological in chapter 8, then in chapter 10, it's again our verse 10:52, then chapter 13, eschatological salvation, 13:20, eschatological salvation. Probably this is not just haphazard distribution of different meanings, but really an important change in the meaning, starting with Jesus going to Jerusalem.
Yeah, and I'd also say, I mean, in general, you know, most of the healings and exorcisms are in the first half of the gospel. So, I mean, I'm not sure that Mark and his readers would have thought of these in discrete terms. You know, healing is part of God's eschatological salvation, which will ultimately, you know, be displayed for everybody when the Son of Man returns in glory. So, I mean, I think, you know, you're right to point out that it's mostly associated with physical healing in the first half of the gospel. And, you know, so there is then a change about midway through the gospel. But that sort of reflects the dynamics of the whole gospel, and where it's moving towards Jerusalem and Jesus' suffering.
Yes. Okay. Do we have any more remarks with regard to the pericope about the second healing of the blind man, or the healing of the second blind man? По поводу
Really, yeah. It's one of the few times where you have a named character other than Jesus and his disciples or the Roman officials.
Yes. And how can we explain this?
I don't know. Maybe he became, a follower of Jesus and was somebody who was well known in his little community. I'm not sure. But the preservation of the name is so rare that it is noticeable. I mean, mostly these characters who just appear in one passage, like this guy, are anonymous. I mean, another exception is Jairus, the synagogue president in chapter 5, whereas his daughter is the one who is healed. Her name is not preserved. And then this woman with the flow of blood, her name is not preserved. So they're both anonymous. So I don't know why his name is preserved and nobody else in that story, their name is preserved. And usually, like the woman who anoints Jesus in chapter 14, that seems like a pretty important thing that she does, but she's anonymous. So anonymous characters are, who just appear in one passage. That's the rule. They're usually anonymous. So when they're not anonymous, then one wonders why.
Yes, I remember in some conservative literature the fact that Mark mentions such details as the name of the blind person, or sometimes other small details are regarded as arguments in favor of these stories ultimately going back to eyewitnesses. I'm a bit in doubt with regard to this, but still a question remains why the name is here.
Yeah, no, I share your doubt that necessarily means that it's eyewitness testimony, because obviously a skillful author can also throw in a name for some reason. I guess in this case, in the case of Jairus in chapter 5, I think like the Hebrew form of that would be Yair, which may mean something about illumination. That would actually fit this passage better than Bartimaeus. What does Bartimaeus mean? The son of Timaeus, maybe, but I'm not sure that anybody has come up with some convincing symbolic interpretation of Bartimaeus's name.
Okay, if there are no more remarks on this pericope, у нас нету, Маша?
May I have a very short remark? I'm sorry if I missed it, but have you mentioned that in this formula with pistis, perfect form sesoken is unusual, and probably it could also indicate that it was used as a formula.
Yeah, well, just the fact that, it occurs in exactly the same form.
Yeah, and this perfect is not expected here. It's a bit unusual. Our audistas would be more natural, I would say.
Right, and you could see how the perfect could fit in, with a Christian rite.
Yeah, that's what I
done to you, but it continues to have effects afterwards. So past action with continuing effects. So yeah, I think that's a good observation.
But we have the same formula in 533, exactly. Repistis su sesequence.
Yeah. Yeah, it appears several times exactly with the same verbal form.
Yeah, I think it appears in other Gospels too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
With Luke, it appears even 4 times.
Oh.
Twice as much as in Mark. And so sometimes, obviously, it is borrowed from Mark, but in other places, it belongs to the Luke's specific material.
Mm-hmm.
And this may also be an indication that we have here a fixed formula that was found both in Mark or his sources and also outside of the Markan tradition.
I do think it's worth paying attention when perfects occur in New Testament literature and the Gospels, especially because, as Masha says, it's not the default tense to use for past action, and so when it does occur, I think sometimes there's a reason for it, and it like there's a perfect that occurs at the very end of the Gospel when it talks about Jesus being raised, right? In 15:6, Jesus the Nazareth, ton estauromenon, the one who has been crucified. Not an aorist passive, but a perfect passive, which, some have seen as indicating that, his crucifixion, again, isn't just a past event that happened a while ago, but it's something that continues to determine reality in the present. I don't know, maybe that's reading too much in, but perfects are so rare that when they do occur, you wonder why.
Yeah, but it's really interesting that outside of this particular formula, repistis su sesequence, aorist tense is normally used.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is significant.
This is true both with regard to Mark and Luke, where we see this formula. So this may be important. Спасибо, Маша.
And of course, you know, if He pistis sus exoticans was a baptismal formula, it would help the readers to see themselves in this story. You know, we also have had our blindness cured. We also have been illuminated by Jesus, and we also therefore follow him in the way up to Jerusalem.
Still, what we have seen up until now, the arguments not decisive, but still important arguments in favor of pistis sus exoticans being a formula. But what is still to be demonstrated is that this was the formula of baptism. Maybe especially taking into account the charismatic nature of early Christianity, this might have been a formula of healing.
Right. Yeah.
Of charismatic healing, which in our established churches does not occur too often, but in charismatic setting, this may well be quite a widespread, right and widespread formula. That's interesting.
Yeah. No, I imagine it. Yeah, I imagine people say it a lot in charismatic settings. I may even have heard it.
In charismatic settings.
Yeah, I used to go to a Pentecostal church, but I can't, but it was a while ago, like 40 years ago, so my memory is a bit dim.
Okay. Let's at least start reading the next pericope, which is of course one of the most.
Let me add a small detail about the translation. If we are speaking about so important things concerning baptism, so it would be better to lift up stylistically what the disciples say to the blind man. In your translation there is смелей, but this is но это немножко детское слово получается. Может быть, поднять немножко стилистически здесь.
Окей. Ваше предложение?
Дерзай, например. Или решайся.
So you're talking about what the other people say to the guy?
Yeah.
Yes, we are talking about the stylistic problems of Russian translation of the Greek tarsei.
All right. So you need to share your screen again.
Yes. I'll do this.
Спасибо. By the way, I'm not sure that it's who's speaking to him here. My impression is that it's not Jesus' disciples, but the people who are there. the same people who tried to shut this guy up, right? So it's kind of funny and ironic that first they tell him, you know, to stop yelling, and then Jesus calls him and they say, "Oh, well, pluck up your courage, he's calling you."
Yes. But what does this Tarsi mean? We have this Tarsi been used several times in description of in the scenes of healing. For example, in Matthew 9:2, the healing of a paralyzed man. Tarsi teknon ephintes su hai hamartiei. What does this mean? Jesus tells the guy to stand up, to take his bed, and to go his home. Not to be afraid to do what he was unable to do earlier, namely to stand up. And Matthew 9:22. O de sus trafeis, kai donauten eipen tarsei, together.
But the blind man, he's not afraid, he's crying.
Yes. These are three cases where we have this expression tarsei. They're all concerned, they're all linked with healings. But what is exactly the meaning?
I mean, I guess I think it's ironic here. You know, it's that again, these same people who tried to get him not to say anything, now they say, you know, oh, pluck up your courage, you know, be courageous. He doesn't need to, as Larissa points out, he doesn't need to be told that because he, you know, he has very courageously and boldly been shouting all this time. So I think it's ironic and a little bit funny, and it reflects badly on these people who tried to shut him up and who now, you know, have changed their tune. But I agree with Larissa that it is, you know, it does seem a little bit odd in the context.
And possibly it is the beginning of the baptism.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can see that, again, I think it would fit in a baptismal context because baptism is a life-changing ritual. And in this sort of early Christian context, to go through that ritual and identify yourself with this, you know, with this sect, which is despised and sometimes persecuted, that may require some courage. So I think it would fit with the overall theory. I think I did
Yeah,
once
but
start to write an article on this subject, and it got lost in the midst of time.
yes, but since we have three very parallel contracts of healing, Matthew 9:2, Matthew 9:22, the same chapter, but another healing episode, and then Mark 10:49. I think we should find in our translation a Russian equivalent that would fit all the three contracts. The synodal translators are not very consequent here. In Matthew, they say дерзай.
And what does that mean? Dierzai.
This means don't be afraid. And in Mark, they say this more explicitly, не бойся.
Yeah.
Probably the best way of translating this Tarsi would be through не бойся, don't be afraid. This would fit all the three contexts. Дерзай не очень понятно. Например, к чему призывает Иисус болящую женщину в Матфея 9:22? Что она должна дерзать делать? Что она могла дерзнуть сделать, то есть прикоснуться к нему, она уже сделала. Может быть, действительно, не бойся, будет здесь лучшим вариантом для всех трех мест. Что скажете, русскоязычные братья?
Ну, просто здесь императив, если бы императив был выражен одним словом, а не двумя, потому что отрицательное выражение «не бойся», оно не так хорошо звучит, как одним словом «смелей».
Там же страха нет, как уже справедливо обратили внимание. Может быть, действительно, тут скорее что-то типа ободрить, там, как-то вот «Зайгет рост», например, в немецком, я смотрю. Вот, что как бы утешься.
Да-да, ободрить, вот именно да-да, что-то типа
Ободрить,
этого.
может быть, да. Потому что страх как раз-таки и женщина, и Вартимей, они как
Да.
раз-таки дерзновение уже явили.
Уже явили,
Но, с
да.
другой стороны, в Септуагинте этот императив всегда переводят «альтир-у», конечно.
Да-да. Как раз, по-моему, у Павла Шлявданского была статья про альтер-у.
И в этом смысле «не бойся» оказывается более эквивалентом.
Ну, в контексте оно не работает.
Почему? Если мы вернемся к нашим трем контекстам исцеления, то вот Матфей 9:2 Иисус говорит расслабленному: не бойся, в смысле, не бойся встать и сделать то, что ты раньше не мог делать.
Бойся встать, Михаил Георгиевич, это как будто вы вычитываете «не бойся встать», там, дерзай, чада. Как бы. Там про вставание еще дальше только будет.
Да, а что, ну, по-видимому, он это и имеет в виду?
Не бойся прозреть. Не знаю, Михаил Георгиевич, по-моему.
Нет, здесь говорится, не бойся того, что сейчас случится чудо. И да, не бойся встать. А как бы это еще перевели на русский язык? Просто словом каким?
Ну, что-то вроде «ободрись» или «утешься», но слово само мне не нравится. А смысл скорее такой.
Ну, Так вот, на первый взгляд, мне кажется, что смысл, который должен быть в этом альтер-у по-еврейски, и, вероятно, здесь в Тарсой тоже, это скорее имей веру, нет? Что не бойся в том смысле, что не теряй надежду, не знаю, в каком таком смысле, да? Должно быть не в смысле именно какого-то страха, ужаса, а в смысле, что не бойся того, что ты будешь оставлен с этим.
Ну, в таком смысле, да, но опять-таки, как это передать, если...
Ну, да-да-да, просто мне кажется, что смысл должен быть, в смысле, мне кажется, что смысл здесь должен быть именно такой. Вот, как это передать, конечно, это совсем другой вопрос. Вот, но,
Ну, это же...
пожалуй,
ну,
на мой вкус, не бойся, оно более, как бы, вот это вот многозначность вот это
универсально.
передает, более универсально, да, потому что дерзать это именно дальше уводит от вот этой идеи веры.
Ну и дерзай, опять-таки, в современном переводе может показаться даже какой-то, так сказать, ироничным чем-то. Всерьез сейчас слово «дерзай» трудно употребить. Вот. А вот не бойся. Ну и вообще любимая тема же говорит, что это самая распространенная заповедь Библии. Так что вот в этом смысле, может быть, действительно, чтобы везде было последовательно «не бойся».
I'm looking at the Syriac translations, um, and I noticed that the Peshitta has et labev, like from the same root as lave in Hebrew. So, may your heart be strengthened or something like that. But the Sinaiticus has two words, la tedchal. So don't be afraid.
Мгм. Да, вот Маша совершенно справедливо заметила, что у нас везде Сейчас видно Бабелворкс на экране?
Да, сейчас Бытие 35:17.
Да, да. Что здесь везде, видите, альтер и у нас переводится как Тарсей. Вот, и дальше у нас то же самое и в других местах Септуагинты.
Да, но там вот есть интересный одно исключение в притчах. Вот, видимо, притчи 31:30, там батах просто, то есть просто верить переводится как торсей.
Да,
Это вот
но это другая форма.
да, но это другая форма, да. Да, это
Это не
правда.
Тарсей, а Тарсей. Но это действительно интересный момент. Спасибо. Но я, пожалуй, что действительно, я бы согласился, что есть смелее немножко не совсем, но, может быть, я вот это переправил на «не бойся».
Не бойся хорошо еще потому, что это такое, как сказать, характерное выражение богоявления. И вспомним, что женщины в конце Евангелия боялись. И вот это все как-то тоже увязывается со многими вещами.
Окей. Да, мне кажется, хороший вариант. Даже подчеркнем, чтобы случайно не переправить его куда-нибудь обратно.
Вернулись
Хорошо.
к синодальному в результате. После долгих поисков.
Да, но по дороге мы поправились на дальние в Матфея в 2 местах, так что нет, мы...
Нет, это, конечно, полезно.
Вот. Да. Хорошо. Тогда мы возвращаемся к нашему тексту. Больше нет у нас замечаний по истории с Бартимеем или предложений.
А
Наши
можете
есть.
вернуть текст ваш?
Да, сейчас возвращаюсь как раз. Вот. Да. Лариса, тогда выступите нашей чтицей для следующей перекопы? Мы, я думаю, сегодня ее не успеем разобрать, но можем успеть начать ее обсуждать.
А докуда прочитать? Наверное.
Давайте, я приложил вплоть до 6 стиха.
Ой. Ну, ладно. Kai gote engidzusin eis Hierosolyma eis Betfage kai Betanian pros to oras ton elaion aposteli duo ton mateton autu kai lege autois jugagete eis ten common ten catenanti humon kai eutius esporeomenoi eis auten euresete polion dedemenon ef gon udeis oipo anthropon ekatisen lusete auton kai ferete. Kai eantis humon eipe tipo jeite tuto eipate hocurios autu chreian echi kai eutius auton aposteli palin gode. Kai apelton kai geuron polon dedemenon pros turan exo epiton amphodu kai luosin auton. Kai tineis ton echei estekoton elegon autois tipo jeite luontes ton polon. Voide eipen autois katos eipen o Иисус kai афекан аутус.
Да. Когда они уже подходят к Иерусалиму, к Вифагии и Вифании, к Масличной горе, Иисус посылает вперед 2 учеников и говорит им: идите в селение, что прямо перед вами. Как только войдете, Эртюс из Парабоминой, мы хотели переводить Маркова и Эртюс как-то более-менее единообразно. Может быть, тут же как войдете, а как, по-моему, как тут же обычно переводили, да? Тут же. Войдете. Или как войдете, тотчас увидите. Как войдете, тотчас увидите. Давайте вот так. Как войдете, тотчас увидите на привязи осленка, на котором еще никто из людей никогда не ездил. Отвяжите его и приведите сюда. Если вас спросят, что вы делаете, отвечайте: господину понадобилось. Он тотчас, вот здесь непонятно, как нам переводить, апостелей палин годе. Я, честно говоря, даже просто на уровне понимания того, кто здесь является субъектом, кто является объектом, вижу несколько вариантов понимания Не могу между ними сделать ясного выбора. Эта история с отвязыванием осленков много перед нами ставит вопросов экзегетических. С одной стороны, насчет ветхозаветных прообразов этой истории, скажем, отсылка к тому, как у нас в благословении Иакова упоминается осленок. Знаете, что Иуда привязывает своего осленка к виноградному кусту. Ну, понятно, что дальше мы это будем уже говорить ассоциацией осленка и вход царя в свой город. Вообще вот роль езды на осленках, на ослятах в Ветхом Завете. Но несколько есть, как минимум, два вопроса, которые я бы хотел вот сейчас, пока у нас еще есть время, наметить, не факт, что их мы сейчас решим. Один вопрос – это что у нас здесь происходит? What does Jesus mean when he tells his disciple to say how curious how to hrein echei? Should this be understood as a reference to curious with capital letter, that God is in need of this S, or they say that their master is in need of the animal to ride upon. And how can we consider?
Yeah.
And the second question also related to this is, how can we consider the end of the verse? Who apostoli? What's mean palin и ходе? Yes, Joel, sorry, you wanted to enlighten us with regard to these details.
No, I mean, I think maybe this is another example of Mark's irony and, how you can read the story on several levels. I mean, you could even interpret what the disciples are supposed to say as a reference to the owner of the cult. I mean, it's like you see somebody breaking into somebody's car and you say, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Oh, the owner of the car told me that I should do this." Um, so, you know, it it could be understood as just, you'll see a cult there and get it. And if somebody challenges you, say, "Well, the owner of the cult has told me to get it." But for the reader, I think there would be, you know, a larger sense that Hokurios has here, right? So it may be operating on a couple of different levels. I also wanted to notice, just before we end, I'm not sure we've ever talked about this, but the first two verses are all in the present, right? They're all
Yes.
present tense verbs, and you're translating them as present tense verbs. Then verses 3 to 6, the main verbs are all in the past. They're all, Hode, Jesus, Hode Apen.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then in verse 7, it switches back into the present again. Whereas I guess in your translation, you have oni privieli. Now that's a past. But I don't. Have we ever talked about the use of the historic present in Mark?
At some point, we paid attention to the constant changes between normal past and present historicum in Mark, but at that point, at least, we decided that these constant changes from past to present historicum should just be understood as a specific feature of Mark's style that probably does not have any particular meaning. But if there is something behind these changes, let's discuss this.
Well, yeah, no, I think I basically agree with that. At least, I mean, it's hard to see why. I mean, the old theory is that the historic present, it's more vivid or something, but I don't know how that would apply in this case. Why you would want to put just the first two verses in the present, then switch into the past for verses 3 to 6, then go back in verse 7. But I'm wondering in for your Russian readers, would they notice the switching from one tense to the other?
In
Would it seem
Russian,
strange to them?
in Russian present historicum is also quite widespread, and even switches from present historicum to past are quite often. So a person, if we translate Mark literally in this way, in this regard, namely always translating present historicum as presence and past as past, I think that in almost all the cases, a normal Russian reader will not even pay attention to these switches.
So then why did you translate it in verse 7 initially in the past? Just
Probably I just followed my translation in verse 7, just inherited the tense from verse 6. I recently wrote a paper on verbs in Greek Psalter. You know this paper. I have shown it to you at some point. Yes,
yeah.
and one of the strategies that the translators of the Greek Psalter used with regard to the Greek tenses, but just to pay no attention to the Hebrew tenses, but rather to continue to inherit the tense value from the previous clause. That's what I did here in my own translation with regard to verse 7. But after you brought to our attention this constant switches between present historical and past, I decided to make the text closer to the original. Another strategy, which is also quite popular with the Septuagint translators. But in fact, for Russian reader, whether I say in verse 7, они привели осленка к Иисусу, покрыли своим плащем, как попоны, и Иисус сел верхом, и фраза «они приводят осленка к Иисусу, покрывают своим плащем, как возгоной, Иисус сел верхом». Мне кажется, тут не будут таких каких-то проблем с переходом от... Sorry. I think there will not be any problems for the reader with these switches from one tense to another.
You know, when I was still teaching and my students would write essays, I would always try to get them to use the same tense, whereas, you know, they would often switch it around. And but I do think it's just natural, you know, in a language like English, probably Russian, Koine Greek, to switch tenses. But I don't know, why do we do that? Is it just for the sake of variety? Somebody I read once said that, you know, it's the present, the historic present isn't any more vivid, but it is used just to mark little transitions in the narrative. But I'm not sure if
Probably,
that works either. I don't know.
yes, probably just for the sake of variety.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that we are quite close to the end of our today's meeting, but I'd like to formulate two questions for the discussion of next Thursday. What does this whole scene mean? Is it a deceit? What is the meaning of the curios here? And especially, what is the meaning of the last sentence? Apostoli palin hode. Let's start our next meeting with the discussion of this verse. Спасибо, друзья, всем, кто с нами был. Thank you, Joel.
Спасибо.
Спасибо, до свидания.